look like to you?
You can flip a negative mood on its head.
This was a talk that was all over the place, but then New York, you are all over the place.
There are experiences that you just don't get anywhere else.
Hey everybody, I am Kal Penn. I'm here with Chasten Buttigieg and the 92nd Street Y for a conversation about Chasten's new book, I Have Something to Tell You, which I had the chance to read early and loved. So thank you for sending that to me when you did.
Thank you for actually reading it. I'm so scared that, when you give it to people, it's like, this is the thing I wrote, but you don't have to read it. And then it means a lot when they actually do.
Well, your approach was also pretty great because I'm in a very privileged position where I have friends who have written books as of late, and sometimes they'll just send it over with no framework. And you were like, hey, here's the deal, coming together quickly, would love any thoughts. And then thank you for asking me to write the blurb. I loved the book. I mean, I think a lot of the viewers, I assume, have also read it. If you folks have not, you definitely should. It's an incredible story, and I want to dive in with the writing the book. How did it come about that you had the chance to tell your story, and when did you decide that you actually would write a book? Because I know a lot of people go the opposite, where there's this platform and you go, I don't want to share.
Yeah, so I was approached to write the book early on in the campaign. Said, I think the Twitter account sort of caught some people's attention, and the story caught some people's attention, and I was approached by a few people, said you should write a book about that, and immediately was like, no, I cannot write a book. Like it was very hard to write a master's thesis. Like there's no way I can do this. But also, to be honest, I don't think I believed in my story very much at the beginning of the campaign. Like really thought that it was worthy of a book. But agreed to take a stab at it, and then very early on in the process was like, okay, this is the book I'm going to write. It's not going to be like political garbage. It's not going to be this like very boring book that has a lot of pages but says nothing. I want it to be fresh. I want it to be candid. I want it to be funny, but I also want it to be like gut wrenching in the moments where I went through a lot and talk about the hard stuff. I want the reader to feel that, but I want to do it in a way that feels very me. And I was nervous that they were going to be like, no, it has to be like political memoirs must look a certain way, which so many of them are, right? It's just not a genre that I'm used to reading, definitely not writing. And I'm glad Pete encouraged me to write the same kind of book too. And so I just kept working at it and working at it. And it's crazy to hear like from you and from other people, like what it meant, and like you caught the tone, and because you just spend so much time on it, right? And
yeah, I mean, that's one thing that struck me, honestly. I think we live in fairly cynical times when it comes to our politics, but also when it comes to stuff we're reading online, right? Like how often do you read something and just your mind immediately goes to cynicism before anything else?
Right.
So when I started reading your book, I just assumed that it was going to have to be a very calculated memoir that, that was like, okay, I'm the spouse of a politician, so it can't be too candid, but it has to be likable enough, whatever that means these days. And it wasn't. I found it to be really honest, which is what I texted you after I read it. Was that on purpose? Like, how do you guys are relatively young, I think, compared to most other politicians that are on the national stage. Is that why you were able to be very open, or was it something totally different?
I don't know. And to be honest, like, of course I passed it off to like political teams, like people that I trusted in politics, and said, please give me your honest opinion. And to be honest, some people were like, you might want to dial it back in some of these areas. You are very young. Who knows what is in store for you? Who knows what, is down the road for Peter? Like, are you really sure that you want to write some of the things that you've written? Some of the things I softened up or decided maybe it's not quite time to share those stories. But a lot of their feedback was like, thank you for your feedback. This is the book I'm going to write. And that just because for me, I did not want to write something that did not feel like me, like myself. But I also think we're at this moment in politics where people are just tired of politics. And they want to see themselves reflected in the people who were elected or chosen to represent them, right, in Washington. And for me, like, was never political. If you've read the book, obviously you realize, like, grew up in rural northern conservative Michigan, like, never thought I belonged in political conversations. And all of a sudden, you know, life changes very fast. I meet this guy, now he's running for president, and I'm trying to figure out who to be on the campaign trail. And was just like, you know what? I got to tell that story. I got to tell that story, and I got to tell all of the stuff that led me to that moment. And my life is not this like glossy, you know, he picked himself up by the bootstraps and figured it out, and now he's, you know, running with his husband. It was sticky and scary and muddy and confusing and heartbreaking. And I wanted, in a way, I just wish, especially as a gay kid, I would have had a book as honest as this one when I was younger.
I think that definitely came out, especially the timeline that you just mentioned, relatively quickly, it seems, from going through what you go through as a kid right up to suddenly being on the national stage. I'm curious, things you talked about, like, you know, growing up in an environment that surrounded sports and hunting, that, you know, that you certainly had a place in. I love the story with was the story with the cattle? I remember texting you about one of these where there's just these,
a lot of cattle.
These stories that I think if you grew up in that environment or didn't, the stories are told so vividly. And I'm curious that there were a couple of times you mentioned how things made you feel a little bit different from your family members, your neighbors. Can you discuss that a little bit more? And I'm particularly interested in how that kind of intersects with your time in Germany.
Oh yeah. So growing up in northern Michigan, it was just very clear to me from a young age, like, you have to be a certain type of man. To be a man, you know, is to be this like God-fearing Christian, like hunting, sporty, you know, very masculine presenting man, and like so heteronormative and very homophobic. You know, so like my brothers are like hunting deer and, you know, skinning a deer in the front yard, and I'm like reading Harry Potter, you know, in my bedroom, or like they're doing things with my dad out in the driveway, like fixing tractors, and, you know, I'm dusting shelves and singing Celine Dion, you know, to my mother. Like, I clearly do not fit in. Something feels off from the beginning. And without, you know, giving away too many things, in high school, my German teacher talks about this scholarship program where students can go on a fully funded year-long study in Germany. And, you know, my family is lower middle class. There's no way they could have afforded to send me on an exchange year. So this sounds like my golden ticket. Like, this is my out. So I forged my dad's signature on the application. I go through the interviews. I wound up getting the scholarship, and it's literally like a golden ticket out of that bubble. And then I go to Germany, and the thing that makes me different is that I'm an American, not that I'm like clearly different from my peers in all of the things that I like and do and don't do. And that finally provided me the space to sort of turn around and reflect on my youth, reflect on my community, my country, and then myself, and figure out like where I fit in and who I truly am. And I don't think, had I not, you know, gone to Germany, I don't think I would have been able to come out. I don't think I would have discovered all those things about myself. You know, if you haven't read the book yet, and I wanted this in there for a reason, right? Because we didn't get to read this when we were kids. Like, the awkwardness of like kissing a boy for the first time, right? Or like feeling the warm fuzzies about a boy, and like coming to terms with like what those feelings mean, and, you know, just all of that fear, and also like internalized homophobia, like all of those emotions that I had to wrestle with. I don't think I ever would have gotten there as fast had I not studied abroad.
Are there experiences or lessons from that time abroad that still impact how you think either about yourself or about the world? Or was that sort of a chapter that you look at in the past and that you've moved on from?
Well, I think it was sort of like the lighter to the firecracker, right? I mean, Germany was the first time I had friends who were like, well, maybe you're just gay. You know, when I finally had the courage to tell them how I was feeling, and then I was like, oh my God, I can't be this way. You know, I'm going to go to hell. My religion tells me that I am twisted and wrong. You know, I'm going to lose my family. I'm going to lose my friends. Then I make friends in Germany who are like, you're probably just gay. Like it's fine. You know, it's just another thing that you could be. And I had never talked to someone about that you could just, about my sexuality before. And then, you know, let alone to have friends who were like, you're fine just the way you are. And that lit something in me, right? Where I gained this confidence, even though I was terrified. It's like, maybe, just maybe, I'll be okay. Like maybe I'll lose everything, but maybe like this monster inside of me isn't really a monster. And at that time, I truly thought that monster had to be like beaten out or like medicated, you know? And I finally made friends who thought that thing was to be celebrated, you know, and not dealt with.
What an incredible feeling that must have been.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I just came home, you know, after Germany, and it was like, I only lasted a couple months, and I had to come out, even though it was terrifying. And, you know, as I write in the book, like I run away from home. I'm convinced I'll lose everything. I at least found the courage to name it. Like I had to say it out loud. It felt like it was boiling up inside of me, and then it was, you know, leaking out of me. Like I just had to say it so it would stop eating me alive. And I just had the confidence to do it.
I want to include, we have a lot of great Twitter questions that I want to include, but I think a good segue to what you just said is a question that came in. What advice would you give today's LGBTQ youth who are contemplating coming out to their families? I know when we've talked about this, we've talked, you know, it's such a personal thing for everybody. But now you're in this position of, you've shared your story, you've written a book, you're on the national stage. What, is there any blanket advice, or does it just vary from person to person?
Well, it's coming out as a personal journey. And I felt like coming out was owed to the world. And I wish I would have known that. I think the way I felt was because I felt like I was obligated to say it in order for it to stop eating me up. And I wish I would have known, I guess my blanket suggestion, advice is, you don't owe anybody a damn thing. It is your journey. It is your story. I know we like to joke about this, but it is true. Straight people do not come out. You never have to come out as straight, right? Why then do we make queer people feel obligated to come out to the world? It is a personal journey. I think the most important thing we have to do is come out to ourselves, to honor who we are and to love ourselves first, to look inward and say, I am a beautiful human being who is worthy of equal rights. I am worthy of love. I am worthy of the space that I take up. And you know what, damn it, I love myself. And I think that was the first journey that I should have gone through. But instead, you know, I figured out, okay, so I am gay. Oh my God, I owe it to my community and my church and my friends and my family to like let them know that I have figured out this thing that, you know, has malfunctioned inside of me. And I didn't realize that, you know, all of that was going to be much harder because I didn't even believe in myself. And you just have to believe in yourself first. You don't owe anybody anything. You don't owe anybody an excuse. Your dignity is not up for debate. Your humanity is not up for debate. And we certainly don't have to put ourselves in positions that make us feel unsafe or unworthy. So if you're contemplating coming out, you know, do it in a way that affirms your existence to yourself.
Very, very well said, and ties really well into a Twitter question that I was trying to figure out where it would go in our conversation, and this is the natural place for
Perfect.
it. Twitter question, Chasten, can you talk about when you told your grandma you were gay?
Oh yeah, hardest part of the book to write. I was like bawling so hard trying to write that. You know, it's like fuzzy eyes trying to see the keyboard. My grandma was just a remarkable woman. Very religious, Catholic, devout Catholic. Very loud woman, opinionated woman. And when I finally worked up the courage to come out to my family, it was sort of understood like, okay, but don't tell grandma, right? Some folks said like, this will destroy grandma. And I loved my grandma. I mean, I adored her. I would go visit her after school. You know, I would take her out to lunch. I just loved being around her. She was so opinionated and funny. And she made me feel so loved too. And I thought, if I come out to this woman, I will destroy this family. So I come out to my family and it's eating me alive, right? This woman that I admire so much doesn't know this thing about me. Again, feeling obligated that I had to tell her, right? It's not like I had a boyfriend to introduce her to. I just felt like I was supposed to tell her. So I think it's a Thanksgiving, a family event. We're all gathered together and I asked grandma if she'll have this conversation with me. So we go outside and we sit in her Mercury. I think it was a Mercury Sable.
Good grandma car.
Oh yeah. And I'm just immediately start crying. And I said, you know, Grandma, I have to tell you this thing. And I can just feel it, like the bricks hitting me, like I am about to ruin this woman's life. And she reached across the car, and Grandma wore a lot of rings, and she grabbed my hand so tight that her rings were like cutting into my hand. And she was squeezing me so tight. And she just said, I know. And I love you just the same. Like, she didn't even make me say it.
Wow.
And that was that. And I told her I loved her, and she said, you know, I love you very much. And that was that. And we got out of the car and we went back in the house. And she really threw me a lifeline there. I thought, you know, if Wanda can love me, you know, then maybe like in turn I could love myself.
Was recounting that, you mentioned you're bawling when you're writing that story, was that the hardest part of the book? Was there even a single hardest part?
Yeah, I mean,
memoir?
I think, you know, get asked that question, I think folks assume like the campaign is the hardest stuff, but by the time my life gets me to this point where I'm, you know, helping my husband run for president, I kind of have a pretty strong understanding of who I am, right? It was when I was younger and I was convinced that I was not worthy of those spaces. I wasn't worthy of family or love, and kind of going back down some of those dark roads and thinking about the person I was and the thoughts that I was having. And then thinking about, and we lost my grandma right after Peter and I were married. Just a few months after we were married, we lost her. And it meant so much to me that she even made the trip to South Bend. That she like had her oxygen tank and her walker, and she was like determined she was going to walk down the aisle and speak at the wedding. The hardest part was this thinking about these people who I was so convinced for 18 years I was going to lose. And then getting to that moment in life where they were all sitting in this church celebrating me and my love and the person that I loved, and then also losing that person. You know, that is why I was so emotional writing about it. It wasn't like, you know, the BS that we dealt with on the campaign trail. Like, I'm a big boy, I can deal with that stuff. But the people that shaped me, you know, and who loved me, some of that was the hardest to write.
Do you feel protective of some of that when you lay it out in a memoir? It's like for everybody.
Yeah.
Right. Was there a point where you had to get comfortable with it? Were there things that you chose to exclude from the book because they were too personal? I'm not asking you to tell us what they were, because
I know. I feel like I kind of put it all out there, right? Yeah. I mean, you've read the book, and that's the reason why I wrote that book. And it's very scary when like friends call me up and they're like, I just finished your book. And it's like, ugh. You know, like there's so many things in there that you just don't tell your friends, or you don't say to your family members. You kind of just, maybe it's like the Midwestern Catholic guilt, but like, you know, you just keep all your feelings like locked up in here and you don't talk about them forever. But I just put it all out there because that is how we bring people together. That's how we make people feel less alone. That's how we save lives, right? By saying, this is what it was like. And sometimes it sucked, and sometimes it broke my heart, and sometimes it broke me, right? But this is who I am. I want you to know who I truly am. But also I did make it out of that, right? And I hope that it's not just, you know, young queer people who can benefit from that, but other people realizing how their vulnerabilities can help save other people, inspire other people. And so, yeah, like when you're talking about really heavy, scary stuff, it's like you normally just don't open up about those things.
Well, that's, to me, that was so clear from reading the book, is that it goes beyond an identity story, and to me, it seemed relatable, no matter what your background is. I mean, I remember texting you like I never grew up with cows, but I felt I could relate to this world that you described. I grew up in a suburb outside of New York City, totally different world, but the way that you tell the story is so vivid and makes you feel like you can relate to every sort of piece that you describe. Do you have writers who influenced how you told your story? Like, who are your favorite writers?
That's the funny thing. So I'm like not a very literary person, like not like my husband. I did not set out to write a book like my husband's book. Like he is a very different writer, a different reader. He's a different mind, right? And when they're like, you should write this book, it's like, but I don't know how to write. But so I picked up some memoirs, right? I was reading Michelle Obama's memoir. I love Dustin Lance Black's memoir. Also a very similar story, right? Rural, conservative family. I was reading Educated, like this idea of another book about sort of growing up and surviving in a rural environment. And the more I read other people's books, the more scared I became of writing my own.
Oh, wow.
So there's like, this person's a great writer. I could never write like that, right? Like I could never write a book like Teets. I could never write a book, like this person. I could never tell a story that way. And so what I ultimately ended up doing was just recording myself telling stories, and then put those on the page because I wanted someone to feel like they were sitting across from me, hearing me tell my life story. And the more I got into other people's heads, the more like their language was floating around in my head from, trying to figure out what I wanted to say about my own life. And like, the only person who can tell this story like Chasten is Chasten. So I actually stopped reading other people's books. And I would like go on these long walks, walk the dogs, and I would record myself telling stories, and people probably walk past me thinking I look like a crazy person, but I wanted to get it all out there the way I would tell it, like at a dinner party or like over coffee, right?
It definitely comes across that
Okay.
way. Yeah, it's an accessible book. I can't say that enough. A couple of questions about politics, and I feel like I'll start with just kind of asking when you talk about how quick it was from coming out to yourself to living your own life to then this really sweet story of how you and Pete met and started dating. When he decided to run for president, he was mayor already when you guys met, right? Yep. So taking that jump to get on the national stage, becoming part of history, was that a conversation you guys had beforehand? Did you know that his campaign was going to sort of bring you guys into the limelight the way it did?
No, and I think when he had the idea to run for DNC chair, it was like, this is a little weird, but like, let's try it out. Like it made sense, right? And of course, his advice to people who are considering running for office is that you have to figure out like, why me, why this moment, why this office, like what do I truly have to offer? And when he decided to run for DNC chair, like it all made sense. So then a couple of years later, right, he's thinking about running for president. Like, some people are asking me to consider this. And I remember being like, okay, sure. Like, I don't know what it's like to run for president. Like, okay, yeah, have those conversations, And then thinking like, it's a long shot. And maybe it'll take a really long time for people to even take you seriously or pay attention to the campaign. Obviously, it took off like that, But in those early conversations, it was just like, okay, honey, yeah, try that, talk about that. Sure, you guys entertain that idea, I'll just be over here doing my thing. I mean, I love him. I believe in him. And as you saw on the campaign trail, I'm biased, but I think, he was uniquely qualified for that position, but had no idea what I was in for.
Was there an aha moment where you guys were like, oh, okay, this just got real?
Yeah, well, he did the town hall in Texas early on, and I remember sitting in the audience and just watching people leap to their feet, and he was just crushing every question. It's like, damn, he's good at this, I remember one event in Iowa where we came outside and there were just like hundreds of people very early on showing up to listen to him speak, and they were just on their feet. Like he just had them, wrapped up in this idea of the campaign. And I remember because I was standing off to the side on the stage, it's like, oh, this is going to be something, and it just took off. And there's still moments where I like look back on that, look at these photos of us in front of like crowds of thousands of people. It's just like, seems like another lifetime ago, probably because of COVID, right, and the quarantine. But in those early days, I remember following him to studios and like people barely giving him the time of day, sort of like laughing at him on air, right? I think it was an interview with Chris Hayes, and he's sort of like being really dismissive of Pete and sort of like, okay, sure, like another guy running for president, like just what we need, right? And then in a matter of weeks, it just like took off.
Were there moments where like I guess he was already in the public eye in South Bend when you guys met. You're not a public figure. And I ask this question of a lot of my friends who are in elected office in various places is, there is probably a fair expectation that if you're a senator or mayor or something, if you represent people, you're out at dinner, they have a grievance, it's relatively fair that they can come up to you, right? Because that is their job. But you're the spouse. It is your personal private time, probably with Pete, especially when you're on a campaign trail. I assume you're not seeing each other every night. You're maybe weeks and weeks, without actually having time together.
Yeah.
Did that get in the way, and how did you guys handle that? Basically, were there struggles being in the public eye that you didn't
For sure. I mean, and when it gets really hard, right? You're like, this is the person that I love, and sometimes you just want to like take that person home, with like a middle finger to the world, like you don't deserve this person, like you don't deserve access to my heart and his heart, especially when it got really hard, right? And the thing, like the homophobic things that were thrown at him, thrown at us, these outlandish, ridiculous conspiracy theories, like I'm taking this person home. And y'all can be stuck with the president that you get. And, when you deal in absolutes, when you deal in purity tests, when you make it this terrible, like knife-filled place, you get what you get. Like, oh my God, look at what we have in the White House right now, right? And it's like, I love this person so dearly. I'm taking him home. You like don't get access to him at all. Especially when you're the spouse, right? People come up to your table and they're like, I don't want to interrupt. I just want to tell you how much of a jerk I think you are, right? And you're like, okay, I am trying to enjoy, right? But 99% of the time, it's great. People say, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but this is what inspired me. Like, you've really changed, my mother's opinion about gay people. You've given me the courage to come out. I've never felt like I belonged more in politics until I saw you, right? Like people share the good with you. And then when you do get that like one jerk on the sidewalk is like, all right, well,
So you're basically, yours is an intimate version of this is why we can't have nice things. Like you just want to take him home and be protective.
I don't know what it is about being a spouse. I write about it in the book, right? Like you're supposed to be everything and nothing, right? Like you're out there, you're public, but also like you're not supposed to be in the spotlight. People aren't supposed to pay attention to you. Don't hog the spotlight, be well spoken, but like don't sink the ship. But there's this another thing about being a political spouse where it's like you are the walking suggestion box. Like people say things to you that they would never say to your spouse. Like
what?
He needs to, I remember being at an event where someone, would just say like the most insulting things about his appearance to me. Like I married that human being. Why would you say that to me? Right? Or like he needs to be taller, he needs to be more muscular, he needs to be like, he should say this, he shouldn't say that. And they would always say like, I know Pete doesn't have a lot of time, so as if my time were just infinite. Like we're both running to get in the same car and someone would pull me aside and be like, I know he's really busy. Like that's my ride to the airport too. Especially when he was mayor, people would stop me at the grocery store and be like, your husband is, they fill in the blank with something really mean and angry. Like, this is doing nothing for, this will do nothing to somebody.
Yeah. No, that's something, I hadn't even considered that aspect of it. Look, I'm an actor, so I try not to read my Twitter mentions. But it's just people like to troll you. It's like, what happened? What happened to his haircut? Oh, he got fat. Oh my God, he lost weight. Is everything okay? Like, guys, thank you for your concern so much. I just hope you like the show. But on your end, you're talking about how that impacts time, how that impacts. I assume people disagree or agree with the platform that Pete was running on, and this ties into another Twitter question. In terms of the politics, were there struggles that you felt, were there things you didn't anticipate from the politics of it all, just even outside of the personal time stuff?
Unfortunately, I feel like politics and media and social media, like people deal in absolutes. Like, you're a good person, you're a bad person. Or like, you are for this or you aren't for this, right? The world is painted in nuance. Our lives are painted in nuance, and people on social media or people on television do not often do well with nuance and context, right? So then we use people's strengths to beat them down, right? Something I love about my husband, he knows exactly who he is. He's comfortable in his own skin and his body. He knows what he believes in. He fights for what he believes in. He is unflappable. He is the strongest person I know. And so because he's this very strong person, people would be like, they would, for example, judge his sexuality based on the pants that he wore. I remember that, like, being on the cover of Time magazine and these people being like, ugh, of course Chasten wore chinos. Like,
what does that mean?
That mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm a middle school teacher. Like, literally, I look like a middle school teacher on the cover of Time magazine. Like, that is just what I wear, And then I start to think about it, like, people aren't ready to talk about what queerness must look like, because I don't think it has to look a certain way. It doesn't have to sound a certain way. It doesn't have to be a certain way. But then, like, in the media, you're being portrayed as one thing. People are talking about your identity, your livelihood, the person that you love, as if it's something that you can, like, dress away, or it's supposed to appear a certain way. And oftentimes I felt like when people had a criticism for him or about us, instead of rooting it in a policy disagreement, they rooted it in our humanity. So this, like, idea of, like, not being gay enough, right? Like, do you have a disagreement with my husband's policy position, or do you truly believe that I am not worthy of being a gay person? Like, I do not get to belong to a community, being called a traitor of the movement because he had a very slight disagreement on how to get our country to Medicare for all, right? But instead of saying, like, I disagree with this policy, which would be the appropriate adult thing to do, people would be like, you're the straightest gay man I know. Like, I can list 15 things that would disagree with your position, but, like, I don't have time,
There's a lot of, I think, just in the world that we live in, there's a lot of projection on people in the public eye. And especially people who I think folks view as having a certain power or opportunity. And so there's a question from Twitter that I think relates to exactly what you said. And it's less of a question and more of just like, can you talk about this? This Twitter question or comment is, I would love for you guys to discuss the intersectionality of LGBTQ communities and immigrants in the struggle of belonging in the U.S. I guess I would add to that, to make it a question. I know, a lot of your tweets and Insta posts during the campaign, you were doing work with communities of color, LGBT groups in rural and urban communities. So I assume this idea of intersectionality with immigrant populations just sort of naturally happened because of the work you were doing. So can you talk about things that you learned and how how it's been fitting in?
Yeah, something I realized on the campaign trail was that many people aren't yet ready, or maybe don't have the language or the ability to talk about intersectionality. That again, the world deals in absolutes, which I think harms so many people when you can't see a person for, like, their holistic being. That you can be Black and trans, right? And that does not define you as a human being, but you do live at this intersection of identities, which gives you a very specific experience and worldview about this country that you live in, right? And for me on the campaign trail, very early on, it was like, I am a cisgender white gay man. My experience in the queer community is one slice of a very big pie. Again, our community is sort of a forced community, right? We are a community because we've been told we don't fit into the norm. We live in a heteronormative society, and so we've been pushed into a group, right? A very large acronym. And so from the start, I was like, I never want people to think that we get it. That we're like, oh yeah, we're gay. So like, the L's and the T's, like we get it too, because we're the G's. Like that is not how it works. And so I wanted us to be out there having these conversations day in and day out, because many people live at the intersection of these identities. And to feel like an outcast is one thing, right? We have all dealt with our own internalized homophobia. We have all lived and do live in a country that makes us feel less than, that literally our rights are up for debate in the Supreme Court. People are being denied housing, being denied employment and equal opportunities in this country based on who they love or how they identify, right? But for me, that experience is only one piece of this large puzzle. And so it's very important for me to be out there speaking with other people who live at very different intersections of identity, even in our own community, about what it feels like to be an outsider in this country. Because you can say you're empathetic, you can be well-intentioned, but unless you're actually having those conversations, and not just inviting people to the table, but like passing the microphone to the people at the table. Like, I need to hear your story. I need to know what it's like to live in your, walk in your shoes. What is this country like for you? Because if I really do make it to Washington, I want to make sure that my work is rooted in a reality of what queer people around this country are going through. And again, I never want to pretend that like I've got it all figured out. 31 years old, I know what it's like to be queer around this country. That's just not true. And for so many people, they are harmed because people don't understand the real lived experience of many queer people in this country.
What are some stories that you remember from the campaign that you may not have had the chance to experience if
Yeah.
people are running?
I mean, my feelings as an outsider, I grew up in a very religious, conservative, rural place, felt like that meant I did not belong there, ran away because I was scared of embarrassing my family, being a disappointment, losing my friends, so that is what drove me to run away for a while. And then I remember being out in the desert in California and had this round table at a sort of housing initiative that helped queer people who were aging out of the foster care system find employment. They were housed there. And I was meeting with this young Black trans woman. And to sort of break the ice, right? You just like roll in, you're like, what's up? My husband's running for president and I'm here to talk about gayness. It can be really off-putting to people, like, tell me about all your trauma. Is like, and like the staffers in the corners, like, we've got 20 minutes, like, yeah. I come in and I say, like, I am here because I think your story is so important. I'm here because there is a very narrow view of the LGBTQ community in Washington. And I want to make sure that our campaign is listening to everyone. So when we get to Washington, we just have a better understanding of the people that we are fighting for. And again, I'm a white cisgender gay man. My experience in this country is, one way. And then I would tell my backstory, right? This is what happened to me. This is what I did. This is how I felt, to try to break the ice with other people. And I remember listening to this young woman who's like, I kind of get that. My family was very conservative. I just knew that this thing inside of me, had to be repressed, and I didn't belong. And eventually ran away, was in the foster care system, had a few different families. And now here I am, and I can't find employment. Every employer in town says I need to dress to the gender that was assigned to me at birth. that I need to look a certain way, and I have to be like sort of out of the view of other people. Like if I am to be employed, I can't really be people facing because that might be off-putting. And like the apartments in town won't rent to a trans woman, right? Like I have never experienced those things. But that person is in the same community as I am in. And we can share this experience of being othered, of being fearful of the country we live in. But those fears still might be very different, you know, in lived experience, not just theory. And I just remember her bravery in like opening up to me so quickly, being like, yeah, let me tell you about how all of this is really messed up, you know, and this is happening to people all around the country. I don't want to take up too much time, but like I remember being in, I think it was Houston, and when the hurricane came through, they bussed a lot of people over to Houston, and organizations that were being given FEMA dollars to run, you know, hurricane operations like housing and feeding people and housing people after the hurricane. Those organizations were religious organizations. So the religious organizations are getting federal dollars, and then those religious organizations are discriminating against the people who need food, who need shelter. So these trans women are coming in, needing food and shelter, and this organization that is supposed to be a beacon of hope after you have lost everything in your entire life is saying, you need to go sleep in the men's area, you need to wear men's clothing, you know, and imagine showing up, getting off a bus, an hour-long, you know, hours-long bus ride, showing up to the door, you know, needing a warm meal and a place to sleep after you have lost everything and being discriminated against right at the door. And these are experiences that, you know, I would have never have experienced in my own life. And that's why it was so important to me to be out there doing the work and listening as much as possible. And I did that every day. And the queer community is vast and it is diverse. We are everywhere and we are everyone, and our experiences are so different. If, you know, we share this, we share many fears, we share many worries and, you know, that feeling of otherness, but they are very different.
I mean, this is every indication that, you know, obviously Pete is viewed as very influential to a lot of people as a public official, but the heart with which you kind of approached a lot of the work that you did on the campaign, I think a lot of people viewed you as, oh, this is somebody who has been influential in my life. Certainly young people who are going to read your book or who have already read it will feel that way regardless of their background, and that sort of hat tip to the intersectionality of that.
Yeah.
I'm curious who some of the more influential people in your life are and how they influenced who you have become.
Sure.
You know grandma, right? Grandma was big.
You know my grandma. You know, in one of the early interviews for this book tour, somebody asked me a really heartbreaking question that I'd never considered before. And it like hit me like a ton of bricks. They were like, who were some of your queer role models growing up? And I was like, I don't know if I have any. Like I didn't have any. And it hurt to think like, wow, I grew up as a child and didn't see myself reflect. I mean, like Harry Potter was like an outcast, and, you know, as a kid, when I was reading Harry Potter, it was like, he eventually finds his friends and where he fits in, and I kind of felt that. It's not gay. Ellen DeGeneres is on TV, but I'm afraid to watch Ellen. I'm afraid to watch Will and Grace because that might signal to my family my difference, right? But, you know, those were two little beacons of hope for me. But I learned so many life skills through my parents, even though I had to run away from them for a time. If you've read the book, you know how much I revere my parents. I mean, strong, hardworking, loving, committed people who do the work. You know, they called me home and asked all the right questions, sometimes asked hurtful questions. And when I told them they were hurtful, they course corrected because they never wanted to hurt me. And that just taught me so much about trust and love and family. Yeah.
All right.
I feel like sometimes people just say like my parents is a cop-out, but really they were like the people who like instilled this sense of like family and you know, family comes first, and love, trust, yeah. And of course then allyship.
Good truthful answer as expected, having read the book. We have another Twitter question, and I will preface this Twitter question with a little context. So you already talked about how, you know, the community is not a monolith. Obviously, our country is incredibly diverse. Those are all really good things.
Yeah.
So inevitably, your husband runs for president. There are going to be people who think he's too far to the left, or like you said, too gay, not gay enough, whatever their issues are. You'd also have people who think too conservative for us, too centrist. So I guess and hearing you talk about a lot of things that I think other folks might think, is there a difference between you and your husband? So this question from Twitter is, did you ever offer Pete your advice about policy or politics? And is he receptive?
All the time. This is the thing about being a political spouse, right? At the end of the day, he spends the most time with me. I would like to think I'm a very influential part of that partnership, where I would hear him practicing things or prepping things, or I could be in a prep room, and he would say something, and, you know, someone could be like, that's it, that's the zinger, use that. And I would be like, no, that is not you. You would never say that. You know, stay true to who you are. And he'd be like, you're right, that is not me. I think I keep him very grounded and rooted in, you know, who he is and why he is doing what he is doing. Not to say like we didn't have disagreements about policy sometimes. I genuinely believe most of the things that he put forward, but obviously like I came to the campaign with a strong, you know, education in the field of education. So when it came time to craft our education policy, I was sitting at the table a lot, and could help him, you know, think about things from the perspective of a teacher. He didn't have that experience going into it, right? I have simply been out longer than he has, and have had more time to be comfortable with who I am, openly and publicly, than he has. And of course, when it comes to a historical campaign, a lot of people are telling him, again, this is very funny, right? People would come up to us on a rope line and be like, stop holding hands, like stop kissing him on stage. Like, we're so close, we can actually win this thing, we can pull this thing off. So like, stop basically like being gay, right? And then you'd have people like, I had people show up to my events like spitting at me and yelling at me and flipping me off because I was like a traitor to the movement, right? So you have people who are like, you are not gay enough. You have people who are like, oh my God, disappear, stop existing, and just let him win this election, right? And you just have to push all that away. Like, I am gonna be who I am, because at the end of the day, like if people love me, I want them to love me for me. And if they hate me, well, at least you hate me, and you don't hate this like version of myself I have crafted for this campaign. You know, I also think like 80% of Americans aren't on Twitter, and of the people who are there, there's a very small fraction of people who are making up the majority of the things that you're reading on Twitter. And it's almost like a pornographic hate machine, where like you get so angry on there, and that's why, because it wants to keep you there, and you get angrier and angrier. And you have to realize like there are 300 million people in this country, and like not everyone believes like that one like clickbaity article that just came out that like says Chasten's straight because he wore chinos on the cover of Time magazine, right? Like that's just like one person. But then everyone like kind of operates in this like, oh my God, this one person said this thing, like that must be the opinion of all Americans. Like, that's not true. Right. You know?
Yeah. Oh, I know. I read, like I said, I try not to, but I read some of my Twitter mentions, and I think the biggest thing, especially when it's like, you know, people may disagree with the fact that I served in the Obama administration, but when it gets to like your 10th tweet at me on a rant, my biggest takeaway from that is, man, the economy is really in a downturn. If you have that much time on your hands,
what are you doing
to criticize me 9 years after I worked at the White House? But I guess, you know, no, that's a good way of looking at it and framing it in terms of how many Americans there are. It's such a small fraction of people who are paying attention to that echo chamber of noise, which is a good thing. I mean, to me, that's a silver lining of ignoring it.
But you could, I mean, I don't want to give everything away if people haven't looked, but like, I would be on the ground in Iowa, like leaning against the gymnasium wall, watching him do a town hall, a couple hundred people there, a bunch of national press following him around. And he talks with like a Moms Demand volunteer about gun violence. He talks to a farmer about tariffs, like the Iowa farmer, like in the overalls and the hat, talking about tariffs and how this president has failed our farmers. He talks to the teacher, he talks to like the mom who's worried about this next generation. And like, then he talks to the teenager, who is worried about climate change. He has all of these like real world rooted issues like being thrown at him, and he answers them so brilliantly. And I'd be like leaning against the wall, like thumbing through Twitter, and there's this like, Elizabeth Warren said this thing, and then Amy Klobuchar said this thing, and Bernie said this. It's just all like, did they say, didn't they say, drama.
The sport, yeah.
And I would know, like the moment he gets done with that event, he's going to go over to the gaggle and they're going to ask him about the thing on Twitter. So then he'd get up, thank everyone. He'd go over to the gaggle, 100 cameras around him. Everyone's yelling questions at him, and it'd be like, Mayor Pete, so-and-so said that perhaps this candidate said this thing. Like, how would you like to respond? And I'm thinking like, did anyone just hear like the Moms Demand volunteer talking about the epidemic of gun violence in this country, or like what the farmer had to say? Like, so much of our real world, like rooted realities are not represented on social media or in the news.
This is a recurring question I get constantly that you're exactly referring to, which is the frustration of questions journalists ask versus questions that people actually want answered. And this was, when I served as President Obama's point person on youth outreach, it was the same thing from the press. Does your background doing stoner comedies impact your ability to be taken seriously? No. You're the only people who are asking about that.
We're literally the only
person I'm reaching out to doesn't think that that's an issue. Well, what are you guys talking about? Gun violence, student debt, and the economy? So it's that kind of frustration that you're articulating. I can definitely relate to, and I'm curious. This is another Twitter question coming off of that, and I know we only have time for a couple more. But so you have your life. Pete obviously was running for president and was in the public eye politically. How did he feel about you writing this book? Did the book come while he was running, or did it come after?
So I had started writing it, pretty early on into the campaign as just like there was no deadline. It was just like a project that, I had agreed to do eventually for someday. Once we ended the race and then we went right into COVID, the publisher was like, we could publish this book now, and now that you're quarantined, like, if you fire on all engines, you could actually finish it this year. The thing that was, I didn't really get to work on it with Pete, like really tell him like what I was writing and, all of my fears and worries until we were done with the campaign. Cause sometimes we literally would only be together for like 20 minutes a day. And the last thing I want to do is like worry him with my own problems and, recognize that sometimes like all he needed was just a loving, supportive spouse there in that moment. So we go into quarantine and then I'm like, this is the book I'm writing. And he loves it. And I remember like coming to him with some drafts being like, can you read this and let me know what you think? And of course he's critical as a writer and then critical as my husband. And I love that he could sort of remind me like, what are you trying to get the reader to feel? It is not about the name of the journalist who told you to lose weight. It's about the feeling that you had when somebody so prominent in the media told you you should lose weight.
Okay, but you want to drag the journalist anyway, right?
I'm not going to drag the journalist. I want the reader to sit in that feeling with me and feel like somebody said that to your face, right? That is the feeling. And so he helped me kind of remember like, one, protect yourself politically, but two, what's the real message you're trying to get across here, right? And when I told him like, I'm not going to write a BS political memoir, he was like, good, because that's not the person you are, right? The American people saw a very different person on the campaign trail, and sometimes I felt like the people as like a spouse, as like the first spouse, the future first gentleman, like people like crafted this idea of like who you're supposed to be. And I felt like I can't be like Chrissy Teigen and Michelle Obama at the same time, like I can't be this like internet personality, but also like, a Prince Like I just got to be myself, you know? And that's why he encouraged me to write this kind of book.
Well, props to you both for being the bigger person in those conversations and not dragging the journalist. I think that would have been the inner instinct in all of us is like, okay, but here's a platform where I can, you know.
But then that would have been the story, right?
Good point. Yeah.
It would have been like Chasten, like, what are the words that they use? Like Chasten drags, Chasten eviscerates, you know.
Yeah. I guess that's what they would want anyway. So you denied them.
They want. I don't care about that person's feelings. I care about my feelings and the way they made me feel. I think that's more important.
Yep. Like
it's not a burn book because it's not about them.
That's a perfect way to wrap it up. My final question for you. Look, the book is called "I Have Something to Tell You." It's out now, so for folks watching, go get a copy. I want to know, A, do you have a favorite bookstore that you would like that you want to plug, and then B, what's one message that you want readers to take away from this book?
Sure. I don't do well in superlatives, but you know, like there's so many cities I've lived in, but it's really rough out there right now for independent bookstores. So my favorite bookstore is an independent bookstore. I mean, I don't think people understand how slim the margin is, you know, on books. And so if you're going to buy a book, if you have the means, please purchase it through an independent bookseller. Your second question was
a message that you'd like readers.
Oh, the message, yeah. I think this book is not just for gay people. It's not just about being gay. It's about the power of our own stories. It's about the power of allyship, showing up for other people, sharing your truths and vulnerabilities. There is tremendous power in that. And I think that is also how we win this election. Project Lincoln is not going to save the election. It's not going to be a sassy tweet that changes your neighbor's mind or your dad or uncle's mind. It's going to be you. It's going to be you reaching out to people saying, this is what's at stake for me. This is what I stand to lose. This is what we all stand to gain. And having those conversations rooted in empathy, the way I hope you see happened in my book, please have those conversations, because that is how we win hearts and minds, and that is how we will win this election in November.
If you folks have not checked out the book, it's called "I Have Something to Tell You" by Chasten Buttigieg, out now. Thanks to everybody for joining. Chasten, this was a really fun conversation.
Thanks, Cal.
Yeah, hope to do more sometime. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Go vote.